The ocean doesn't forgive, and neither do the stories it hides. Every cruise promises escape, laughter, and luxury, but some passengers find themselves trapped in horrors the brochures never mention. Imagine hearing footsteps outside your locked cabin when no one is there, or seeing the same stranger on every deck, only to discover their name was never on the manifest. What you're about to hear are true accounts. Checked, rechecked, and pulled straight from real people who swore they'd never speak of it again. This isn't fiction. These are encounters that stain the memory of anyone unlucky enough to sail into them. So turn the lights down, put your headphones on, and step aboard Midnight Outcry. Subscribe, hit the bell, and drop a comment, because once these stories begin, you'll feel like you're on the ship yourself, and not everyone who boards ever makes it back. Story 1. I want you to believe me when I tell you that the events on that trip were not just odd, but also horrifying. And I would probably laugh in your face and dismiss it as an urban legend if I hadn't experienced it myself. However, I was present. I witnessed it. Additionally, I can't stop hearing her voice. Trevor is my name. My sister Kayla encouraged me to finally take a break, so I impulsively booked the cruise last summer. She and her boyfriend Nate accompanied me. Being the third wheel didn't exactly excite me, but I reasoned that spending 5 days at sea would be preferable to remaining at home alone with my shoddy apartment walls. The first night was as expected. There was music, alcohol, packed decks, and the sea seemed to go on forever in the moonlight. However, I didn't see her till the second night. About my age, with pale skin and dark hair pulled back in a loose braid, she was leaning alone on the railing. I noticed that she was standing too rigidly, as if she were trying to keep herself together. I nearly remained silent, but I could tell she was crying as she turned her head. "Are you all right?" I inquired. She gave a start as if no one had noticed her. Then she smiled, too hastily, too artificially. Indeed. Simply put, "I'm seasick." "I'll be all right." Her voice sounded low and scratchy, as if she hadn't spoken in a while. I ought to have left. However, I didn't. I wanted to stay and listen to her talk for some reason. Elena was her name. After we spoke for a bit, I swear that I felt stranger the longer I stood there. She felt as though the air was damper, heavier, and more static charged. My shirt was sticking to me like I had been standing in fog when I eventually excused myself to go look for Kayla and Nate. It ought to have ended there. A strange run-in with a lone traveler. Nate scowled, though, when I brought her up at breakfast the following morning. "Elena?" he asked again. "Elena is not on the passenger list, Trevor, dude." Last night, Kayla and I looked. I dismissed it with a giggle and said he was playing me. However, Kayla also swore, claiming to have looked through the complete list that was displayed next to the front desk. "No, Elena." I ignored it. Perhaps she had misrepresented her name. For whatever reason, she might not have been on the official list. However, I saw her again that evening. Same location. She has the same tears in her eyes, and when she smiled this time, I noticed something change behind her teeth, as if there were water shining where none should. She said in a whisper, "You'll help me, won't you?" before I could respond. "Will you remain?" That night I hardly slept at all. I kept hearing her say, "You'll help me, won't you? Will you remain?" When I eventually fell asleep, I had a dream about water soaking the carpet beneath my cabin door and rising above my knees, ankles, and chest. And I could see her face through the distortion, pallid and blurry, grinning as though she had been waiting there the entire time. I awoke with a gasp, my shirt soaked through with perspiration. It wasn't simply perspiration, though. As if they had just been taken out of the washing machine, the sheets felt clammy and wet. As I looked for leaks in the ceiling and an overflowing sink in the bathroom, my heart pounded, but I found nothing. Except for the bed, everything was dry. I kept Kayla and Nate in the dark. When I brought up Elena over breakfast, they had already given me a sidelong glance. I didn't want to come across as more insane. However, I couldn't help but return to the deck where I'd seen Elena that night, after Kayla and Nate left for a comedy concert. I convinced myself that I would only demonstrate her absence, that I had imagined everything. She was present. Same location, the same braid, the same rigid stance. When I approached her this time, though, I saw something I hadn't before: her outfit. Unlike everyone else's shorts and sundresses, it wasn't cruise casual. It had an aged appearance, out of style. The hem brushed her ankles, the cloth was heavy, and the neckline was high, like something from a snapshot in black and white. When she saw me, she grinned. "You returned." My throat became parched. Her eyes held me there, even though I wanted to get away, like a drowning man holding onto your arm and not letting go, but not in a seductive way. "Yeah," I replied. "I suppose I did." She leaned forward, her lips quivering. Nobody else pays attention. I'm not even visible to them. However, you do. Suddenly, it seemed like I was the only person with her as a chilly breeze blasted across the balcony. The sound of the waves hitting the hull drowned out the music and laughter coming from inside the ship. I looked back. It was only a few steps to the lounge entrance. She was closer, though, when I looked at her once more. "Please," she said in a crackly whisper, "don't abandon me here." Then she extended her hand. In the light from the deck, her hand appeared normal, with delicate, pale fingers. However, as soon as her fingers touched mine, cold water poured down my wrist and seeped into my sleeve. With my heart pounding, I automatically yanked back. She was gone when I looked again. No footsteps, no shadow retreating, only the damp area on my arm that was leaking onto the deck. I shivered as I stood there, still feeling as though she had not vanished. She had just slipped beneath the ship's surface, observing, awaiting. I tried to convince myself that it was stress, that the lights were playing tricks on me, or that my mind was making things up. The damp sleeve, though. In fact, the way the water trickled across the deck, it was more difficult to explain. Kayla noticed in the morning. She looked at the sleeve of my shirt from last night while she was brushing her hair. "What's causing this moisture?" She scowled. I went cold. It was still dangling over the chair, heavy and damp, and I hadn't even noticed. "Drink spilled," I whispered. I could tell she didn't trust me. Nate and she looked at each other. They believed I was losing it. We made the decision to stroll along the promenade that afternoon. It ought to have been an ordinary, bright day at sea. However, Kayla halted in the middle of her stride and gazed at the glass exhibit of vintage cruise artifacts in the hallway. There was a framed picture behind the glass, cracked at the edges, sepia-toned. A group of people on an older ship's deck, posing, grinning, and holding hats and parasols. There she was, Elena. The same long dress, the same braid, the same hesitant, dim smile. Kayla responded, "Wait," as she leaned in. "That girl resembles the one you described exactly." I felt sick to my stomach. Nate gave a snort. "Fortuity. Individuals have similar appearances." "No," I blurted out, my heart pounding in my ears. "That's her. That's..." The glass froze beneath my fingertip as I pointed. On the interior, condensation. We all three froze. Then, like the trail of a single drop of water, the condensation started to slowly and deliberately streak downhill in front of our eyes. All it did was spell something. 3 letters. H-E-L. Kayla staggered back and covered her mouth with her hand. Nate grabbed my arm and muttered a swear. "We're heading out. Right now." But the lights in the corridor flickered as we turned. Every polished surface, including the windows, the glass exhibit, and even the floor tiles, briefly mirrored her face instead of ours. Elena. Behind us, she had also stopped smiling. That night, I was unable to sleep. Outside the cabin door, every ship creak was like footsteps. Her name sounded like her whisper in every gust of wind. Kayla made an effort to remain composed, but I could tell she was also shaken. "It's just old glass. Condensation does weird things," she insisted repeatedly. However, she didn't think so herself. Conversely, Nate had entered a state of complete denial. At dinner, he informed us we were letting our imaginations run wild and ordered 2 more cocktails. However, something occurred that evening that tore our denial apart. I woke up at around 2 in the morning to the sound of dripping. Go slowly and steadily. I initially believed it to be coming from the bathroom sink. However, I noticed the source as I turned over. There was water on the dark carpet next to my bed. It stretched forth in a pool. My heart was pounding as I sat up and realized it wasn't coming from the ceiling or the sink. From beneath the floors, it was rising. Then I caught sight of her. Elena stood against the outside railing through the glass of the balcony door. She had wet hair that was stuck to her face. Her lips moved silently as her fingers pressed flat against the glass. "Kayla," I said in a raspy tone. She awoke, followed my eyes, and let out a scream. Nate swore and shot to his feet. "What the?" But Elena was gone when he looked. Only the sea outside. However, the water in our cabin remained. It continued to rise and leak until the entire carpet was drenched. After yanking the door open, Kayla pulled us barefoot into the hallway. Confusion gripped the other passengers as they peered out of their rooms, but their floors were dry. The only one that had flooded was ours. We shook and soaked as we rushed straight to guest services. We got a tight smile from a weary-looking worker wearing a blue jacket. "Number of the cabin?" I informed him. He froze his fingers on the keyboard. He glanced at a supervisor on the other side of the desk. I leaned closer and whispered, "Sir," my voice cracking, "there's a problem with that room. Somebody," he interrupted me. "No one is using that cabin. It hasn't happened in years." My face was emptied of blood. "What are you discussing?" "Ever since we boarded, we have been residing there." He gave a headshake. "No, sir. The cottages in that portion are shut, following the mishap." I held on to the counter. "What happened?" With a loud clearing of his throat, the supervisor glared at the attendant. However, the word escaped, despite the man's lips quivering. "Drowning." The lights above us then began to flicker, and for a brief moment, I swear, I saw Elena's reflection standing right behind us in the polished marble counter. Neither of us returned to the cabin. We were unable to. It felt impossible to even pass that corridor, but the attendant offered us another room. Kayla's fingernails dug into my arm as she held on to me. For once, Nate was quiet and pallid. We were escorted down to another deck, and neither of us said a word. But aboard a ship like this, being silent won't keep you safe. The sound of a camera shutter awakened me up at about 3 in the morning. Throughout the darkness, there was a steady, gentle, mechanical click. My chest constricted. I looked around the room. Nate was snoozing peacefully on the next bed, and Kayla was cuddled up next to me. Click, click. The balcony was the source of the sound. With my heart pounding, I slid out of bed and drew aside the curtain. Elena stood outdoors. She wasn't merely staring, though, this time. She had a camera in her hand. My camera. I had left it in the old cabin. Despite the curtain separating us, I felt the brightness sear inside my skull when she lifted it and took a picture. She was gone when my eyesight cleared. The camera wasn't, though. The strap was wrapped like a serpent, and it was resting on the balcony floor. I opened the door against all my instincts. The air was salty. When I picked up the camera, it was freezing cold. As though it had just been retrieved from the sea, the lens was damp. I flipped through the images with trembling fingers. They didn't belong to her. I was in them, dozing off, strolling, at supper, laughing, positioned near the railing. Every second since we got on board, documented from nonsensical perspectives. And her reflection hung just behind me in every picture. Grinning. I dropped the camera as if I had been burned. Nate took a seat. "What's happening?" Kayla's tone faltered. "She isn't abandoning us. She has a desire." The spacecraft let out a deep, guttural groan that sounded like metal buckling under strain. The lights then went off, with only the dim gleam of moonlight peeking through the glass. Blackness engulfed us. The water returned at that point, this time from the ceiling rather than beneath the carpet. It fell like a tsunami, pouring in sheets. In a matter of seconds, the water reached to our knees as we clambered into the mattresses. With the storm howling outside, Kayla shrieked when the balcony door ripped open. Elena was standing in the doorway, her eyes as dark as the depths, and her body soaked. Her lips moved, and I heard her voice for the first time, gurgling through imaginary water. "Go home." The chamber was engulfed by the flood. Nate struggled against the water. Kayla slipped out of my grasp, and I felt myself drawn toward her to the balcony. With the boundless water behind her, her arms were open and inviting. Then there was stillness. The sun shone when I opened my eyes. The cabin was dry and immaculate, as though nothing had occurred. Nate and Kayla had left. Their beds were put up nicely. Their possessions are gone. There was only one item left on the bedside table: the camera. My hands were shaking when I lifted it. Overnight, one new picture had been printed from its slot. Me. By themselves. Out on the balcony, her hand resting on my shoulder, her reflection behind me. And underneath it, "Last passenger boarded," written in weak, salt-smeared pen. I've been skeptical all my life. Curses, urban tales, and ghost stories all seemed like ways for people to divert their attention from things they didn't understand. Back in Denver, I had an IT position where debugging and logic were paramount. It most likely didn't exist if I couldn't identify the issue, isolate it, and resolve it. That's how I spent my life. That conviction was upended by a cruise vacation I took with my younger sister last summer. Mia is her name. She wanted to celebrate her 21st birthday and her college graduation before starting the demanding process of internships and full-time employment. A 7-day Caribbean trip seemed like harmless fun, I thought. Open ocean, food and sun. What might go wrong? Buffets heaped high, music by the pool, and sea air that burned our skin just enough to sting were all part of the first 2 days. However, I was troubled by something about the ship right away. The glass. Mirrors, reflecting walls and windows that never seemed to block off the ocean, were everywhere. I had the impression that I was being observed all the while, and that I was passing through a mile-long funhouse. It began on the third night. I had just returned from a late-night comedy show with Mia. She paused in front of the mirror outside our cabin when we were still laughing and intoxicated by expensive beverages. Her grin stopped. "What?" I inquired. She didn't respond. She continued to gaze at the glass. I followed her eyes. Just our weary reflections, two siblings dressed for vacation. For a moment. Afterward, it wasn't. There was a little girl standing in the mirror behind us. Barefoot. Pale. She looked as though she had just climbed out of a swimming pool, with her hair hanging damply across her face. She also had Mia's hand in hers. I nearly fell after spinning around so quickly. There was nobody in the hallway. Silence, doors, and carpet. However, the female was still visible in the mirror. Grinning. As if she had been scorched, Mia jerked her hand back. "Did you notice that?" she muttered. My stomach fell because I had witnessed it, even though I wanted to deny it and tell her that she was just dreaming. What I'd seen, I knew. There was no illusion about the girl. Her smile had been filled with purpose and weight. Mia turned on all the lights and shut the door when we entered the cabin. I tried to reassure her by suggesting that it might have been a reflection from another traveler. However, even I thought the excuse sounded flimsy. There had been no one in the hallway. I had trouble sleeping that night. The engine noise throbbed in the walls like a heartbeat, and the cabin was windowless and black. That girl's pallid face would always pop out from the glass when I closed my eyes. I rolled over around 3 in the morning and froze. The room was slightly reflected by the black, off TV screen. I could see our two forms in the bed in the haze of the darkness. And there's a third, smaller one at the bathroom door. Heart-pounding, I sat up quickly. The image disappeared. All that was visible on the screen was black static. The following morning, Mia refused to eat. As though she was waiting for someone to show up in the cabin mirror, she continued to stare at it. She simply shook her head when I inquired if she had seen anything during the night. But I could tell plenty from her quiet. She had. By the 5th day, we had stopped laughing. We walked with our heads down and avoided the mirrors in the hallways, but it made no difference. A cruise ship's glossy metal lifts, glass walls, and even the pool's gleaming water are all reflections. She also trailed after us. In the corner of my sunglasses, I would catch a glimpse of her face, or her silhouette, which could only be seen behind the glass wall, standing among the others at the buffet. When we stared at her directly, she remained motionless. Only then we looked away. I didn't ask Mia how she knew, but she murmured to me that night. She was sitting on my bed. Her voice was shaking, so I knew it wasn't a dream. It was intended to be a formal evening on the 6th day at sea, with everyone decked out, the dining room glistening, and pictures shot on the grand staircase. I made an effort to persuade Mia to go. Perhaps everyday diversions might help us get over our paranoia. Reluctantly, she consented and changed into a navy dress she had brought. It nearly worked for a short time. People were grinning and clinking champagne glasses as the chandeliers sparkled and the string quartet played music. For once, Mia was able to grin when the photographer requested us to pose close to the stairway. The picture printed right away. The moment I saw it, my chest constricted. The girl stood behind us, blurring slightly as though she were farther back. The slightest smirk tugged at her lips as she wore a white dress and inclined her head. With my heart pounding, I flipped the picture over in my palms. She was gone when I looked again. Just the two of us, grinning rigidly into the camera. It was stuffed inside my pocket. I kept it from Mia. Still, she was aware. She caught me in the cabin later that night and said, trembling, "You saw her, didn't you?" Once more, I lied, told her that she needed to sleep. However, when she eventually fell asleep at midnight, I took that picture out of my pocket. Once more, she appeared. In the print again. This time, the girl did not disappear. Her face appeared more distinct, sharper. Around me, the ship creaked. Through the door's tiny crevices, the scent of salt air permeated the room, and I swear I saw movement in the TV screen's dark glass. I pivoted. There is nothing there. She was closer when I turned back to the picture. I threw it under my pillow, dropped it, and stayed up all night, staring at the ceiling, while the constant hum of the engines reminded me that I was stranded far from land. Mia was hardly able to speak by the 8th day. As she pushed food around her plate at breakfast, she kept looking at every gleam of steel and glossy surface. I extended my hand to console her. I became aware that her reflection in the window was not moving in unison at that point. On the table, her actual hand was motionless. The hand of her reflection was caressing her own hair. I firmly grasped her wrist. "Avoid looking at it," I muttered. As if I had burned her, Mia yanked her hand back. A few irritated looks came from the tables close as her fork clattered against the dish. She was indifferent. She got up so quickly that her chair fell over. I moved through the crowd after her. Every glossy surface we passed, including the reflected marble, mirrors, and chrome panels, gave a new image of her as she bounded toward the elevators. In one, her smile was too big. Her eyes were completely dark in another. In the corridor, I took hold of her shoulders. "Stop! Please stop!" She gasped for breath. "That's her," she muttered. "I have her inside of me." I wanted to correct her and tell her that she was anxious and overtired, but I could feel her. But the girl in white was standing right behind her when I gazed at her face, through the elevator door's glass. Her shoulders were touched. People shuffled out, unaware as the elevator dinged open. The image disappeared. We didn't enter. I locked us in the cottage that night. I covered the TV with an extra blanket, tucked towels beneath the bathroom mirror, and closed the blinds. Pulling her knees to her chest, Mia sat on the bed. I must have fallen into a light sleep about 2 in the morning, because the sound that woke me up wasn't typical ship noise. It wasn't the creak of steel or the sound of engines. It was a laugh, shrill, like a child. I opened my eyes. They found the TV. It was there, the dark screen reflecting the faint light from the bedroom lamp, even though I was positive I had secured it. Additionally, Mia was no longer seated on the bed in that reflection. Panicked, I turned. She was present, however, standing, too near, right next to me, grinning in the shadows. I scurried back. "Mia," she used 2 tones and 1 layered voice. "She dislikes being overlooked." I sprang for the light switch. Sparks poured out as the bulb flared and exploded. Once more, darkness engulfed us. Additionally, the bathroom mirror, which was no longer covered, gave off a faint glow as though something had moved behind it. I don't recall dozing off. Fear may have caused me to black out. However, Mia was gone in the morning. Unopened, her suitcase sat. She left her shoes by the entrance. The thin impression on her pillow, which was smaller than her head should have created, was the sole indication that she had ever been there. Like a crazy person, I ripped open the closet, looked beneath the bed, and even opened the small safe in case Mia had somehow gotten into the cabin. Nothing. I shouted her name as I rushed barefoot into the corridor and banged on doors. No one had noticed her, but a few irritated guests had peered out. They called security. They interrogated me till I felt like a criminal, investigated the cameras, and examined the stairwells. However, the same horrifying feature appeared in every viewpoint of the video they showed me. Mia was never on them. Not once. They last retrieved a video from the previous evening's atrium. I was there, helping her through the mob while holding her hand. But I wasn't holding anyone on camera. I had nothing in my hand. I maintained that they were mistaken, that the cameras had malfunctioned, and that the video had been altered. However, when I yelled, I noticed my image in the gleaming conference table we were seated upon. She was present, the white-clad girl, not Mia, observing me. After that, I quit fighting. I was unable to. I can't really recall the rest of the cruise because it was a nightmare. I'm aware that folks whispered to each other as I passed. I am aware that the staff grew increasingly aloof and chilly. And I am aware that she was lurking at my side in every reflected surface, including the chrome elevator doors and the water in my glass. Back in Miami, I staggered down the gangway by myself as the ship docked. Regarding Mia, nobody inquired. Nobody even pretended that she had been there. I promised myself that as soon as I arrived home, I would report the missing individual. The only thing that kept me sane was that. However, I saw something when I placed my suitcase on the couch after arriving at my apartment. Rattled and fatigued, I had a lighter suitcase. When I went inside, I saw that Mia's clothes were folded nicely and placed next to mine as if they had always been there. The top zipper was already partially open. I went cold. Something stiff caught my hand near the bag's bottom. It was the picture of us taken on the first day by the cruise ship photographer. Mia wasn't beside me, except in the print. It was the white-clad girl. She smiled up at the camera as her little hand curled around mine. She was still holding my hand when I turned to face my own reflection on the black screen of my television across the room. The worst thing, in my back pocket was the cruise keycard. Furthermore, it wasn't mine. With the keycard squeezed between my fingers, I sat motionless. It was old, damaged, and had a nearly naked magnetic strip. The cabin number that was printed on it wasn't mine when I turned it over. Mia had written the same number on the napkin the night I first met her. The sun had sunk low, causing sharp red streaks to bleed through my blinds when I woke up, though I don't recall blacking out. On the table, my phone buzzed. The sender was blank and a new notification that said, "Itinerary reminder, formal night, deck 5 ballroom. No contact, no app. There, just there." The phone was thrown across the room by me. She was closer when I looked back toward the mirror over the couch, even though my chest hurt and my breath was coming in short gasps. Standing with me now, rather than behind me. Her pale face almost touched mine as her mouth moved, and she said something I couldn't understand. Then I heard 3 piercing knocks on my door. I remained motionless. This time, the knocks were more intense. My heart felt like it could burst free as it struck my ribs with such force. I approached the door with trembling hands and put my eye to the peephole. Outside, the corridor was deserted, but a white frock rippled in the air, stretched and warped in the fisheye glass. I staggered back, gripping the keycard so firmly that my palm was wounded by its edges. The frame shook with the 3rd knock, and then, no sound. Since then, I haven't opened the door. I'm not sure if she's waiting, or if the spacecraft is attempting to transport me back. I just know that my apartment has always smelled like the sea. I can still feel her tiny, icy hand curled inside mine while I sleep. The music began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a piano being strung in a dream. However, I could hear it coming from the vents of my cabin. The ship was meant to remain silent, yet it was midnight. I'm Ethan Cross, a 32-year-old San Diego marine biologist. After my lab shut down, I booked this cruise because I wanted a reset and a vacation from reality. I'm introverted, cautious, and constantly questioning myself. Yet that night, I was swayed by the allure of the water. I went out into the hallway. Long shadows that appeared to bend around the edges were created by the flickering lights. The air was heavy with the scent of sea salt and polished wood. From the upper decks lured that faint, eerie song. I observed something odd as I got closer. Even though all of the doors in the hallway were locked, there seemed to be some faint laughter coming through the walls. And glasses were clinking. The passengers appeared to be there, but they weren't. I arrived to the viewing lounge's opulent stairway. The music grew louder, brighter, happier, but there was nobody there. Only the lights, glistening on the gleaming flooring. My stomach rumbled. There was a problem. In the corner of my eye, a shadow moved by. I spun around abruptly. Nothing. Just the faint reverberation of non-mine footfall. Maybe it's just a private event staff rehearsal. I thought in a whisper, but suddenly the first voice came out, clear and frighteningly near. "You're welcome," I froze. Even though no one could be seen, the statements carried weight and authority that caused my bones to hurt. The lounge's doors creaked open gently. A bright radiance poured out. My curiosity fought every instinct that told me to go back. I entered. The space looked opulent, unspoiled by time, with chandeliers illuminating tables piled high with unopened food and wine bottles with curled, fading labels. Even though there was a complete orchestra playing, nobody could be seen. Then they showed up. Initially, silhouettes of men, women, and children gathered around the tables, all grinning and dressed as though the 1920s and the present had merged. They had too much gleam in their eyes. Their motions were smooth, yet oddly robotic. With a platter of glasses full of a glittering amber liquid, a server slid forward. I saw that nobody else on the ship appeared to be aware of this meeting. Employees were walking by in the hallway outside without a clue. The waiter pushed, in a smooth, melodic, almost mesmerizing voice, "Try one." Hesitantly, I held my glass. My hand moved before I could stop it, even though my intuition told me it was dangerous. The world tipped the instant the liquid hit my lips. The room altered when I blinked. Like skin, the walls pulsed. The ceiling was as high as it could go. The laughter was twisted, the music warped. Once smiling figures now gazed with empty eyes. They started to fade away, one by one, almost as if they had never been there. I staggered back. The glass broke in my grasp. Twisted representations of the attendees were reflected in the shards as they glinted beneath the chandeliers. Those who drank, I learned then, were never seen again. I turned to run. They slammed the doors. I placed my back against the wall, my heart pounding, every instinct screaming to go as the waiter muttered, "We've been waiting." And his smile grew impossible. The ballroom's golden radiance pulsed as if it had its own heartbeat. The distorted music was still audible to me, overlaid atop incoherent yet desperate whispers. I tried the closest door, locked. Nothing, no handle, no key. The wood was polished and unyielding. Behind me, I heard footfall, light at first, then louder, like if they were pacing in sync with my own heartbeat. "Ethan!" I didn't say the name. It was shallow, melodious, and laced with sarcasm. I felt sick to my stomach. The ship's layout appeared to have changed, so I dashed along the hallway in quest of a stairwell. Doors opening into walls, stairways leading to ceilings, and hallways that twisted unnaturally, turning back on themselves. The cruise ship had lost its usual order. I once caught a glimpse of another traveler, a young woman with a big smile on her face who was carrying the very same drink that I had spilled. She gave me a wave. She had vacant eyes that gleamed like deep ocean. I blinked, and then she was gone. In search of safety, I attempted the closest cabin door, but the ballroom's reflection was within. The same mechanical visitors, the same distorted music. I flinched and staggered back into the hallway. I discovered a vent that was open a bit. Inside, every drop sounded like a gunshot, and the metal walls were slippery with moisture. The next hallway was empty when I peered out. Too silent. Too quickly to follow, a shadow moved across the floor. Just behind me, I heard moist, smooth breathing. I staggered into a crew tunnel I had never seen before, pushing onward. A steady buzz of machinery permeated the air as lights flickered overhead. Strangely, this place had a sterile, clean fragrance. But then, as if the ship itself were layered in other universes that overlapped, the scent of salt and rot came back, stronger. I stopped. There was a flutter of paper on the floor. I grabbed it. Written in a beautiful flowing script, the note read, "Once they get there, they don't go. Make a smart choice." I felt cold. I tried to ignore it and concentrate on getting away. The footsteps, however, came back. Multiple pairs now. Faster. Darkness lurked at every turn. I sensed them, observing, waiting. I went into a storage area and hid. Empty. Until I discovered that there were no supplies within the packages. Photographs, passports, and little mementos belonging to people who had vanished earlier in the cruise were among the personal items that were crammed into them. The lights wavered. I noticed motion in a stainless steel panel's reflection. The previous young lady, more warped, her smile stretched out of control. As though inviting me to join her, she raised a glass in my direction. I hurled a container at the panel as I scurried. The figure disappeared, but the quiet, relentless music started up again. It was not limited to the ballroom anymore. Now, the sound was all over. Under my skin, in the floor, and in the walls. I paused, inhaled deeply, tried to use common sense. If you're listening, take a second to subscribe to Midnight Outcry. It helps keep stories like this alive. I said into my phone, recording a voice message in the hopes that whoever heard it would understand what had happened. Don't overlook the peaceful areas if you're on a cruise. I bolted as the voice note caught a faint echo. Not mine, a secondary layer behind it, a whisper. "We've been waiting for you. Don't answer the calls. Don't accept the drinks. Stairwell. Cabins. Halls that fold in on themselves." After rising to a crescendo, the music suddenly ceased. Quiet. Then he emerged at the end of the hall. A tall, unnaturally slender crew member with tar-black eyes is carrying a tray. I was wise enough not to accept it. However, the corridor behind him ended in emptiness. I went cold. I remained motionless. My feet were stuck to the ground. Standing in silence, the crew member held the tray as though it were both an offer and a weapon. The corridor behind him went on forever into the dark. Not only dark, as if the world had ended in emptiness and the ship had been cut open. Every beat of my heartbeat was louder than the one before it. I made me move my legs. I moved sideways, hugging the wall as I went. I knew that as soon as I turned to face him, he would be there. Closer, faster, and unstoppable, despite my every instinct telling me to run. The tray shook. There was no source for the faint illumination, but the amber liquid in the glasses reflected the feeble light. My stomach twisted. I wanted to yell, but I couldn't. I staggered into an alcove as a whisper glided over the wall. "It's easier if you just drink." Impossibly, the passageway curved into a room with mirrors. Even though it wasn't me, my reflection was staring back at me. With vacant eyes and a glass in hand, my reflection grinned. I flinched. Behind me, the door banged. Panic gave way to deliberate desperation. I looked around the room. A tiny maintenance hatch was present. I forced the door open and climbed in. Rust odor, cramped quarters, and metal walls. With my illumination barely piercing the darkness, I crawled. Then, the sound started, circling, gentle footfall above, then below. The ship knew, I realized. My terror was matched with every groan, echo, and shake of the metal floor. A dim light came up ahead. Finally, I arrived at a service elevator. I hit the button to access the upper deck. The doors opened with a sigh. Empty. I felt a wave of relief until I went outside. It was a different deck than the one I had previously entered. It was drier, cooler, and more hazy. I saw no ocean, only dark mist, but waves broke over the rails. Then, I caught a glimpse of them, travelers, motionless, as though frozen in mid-step. They watched me. One made a move, slowly, grinning, keeping a drink in hand. I gasped. They were dead. Not at all. I ran, looked for the actual upper deck. The lights were swallowed by the growing fog. The passengers kept coming back, getting closer and quicker with each curve I made. I ducked into a lifeboat storage bay, expecting it would be a dead end for them, while their words blended into a single, eerie chant, "Drink, stay, forever." However, the doors behind me slammed. I was confined. Everywhere you looked, the amber glow from the drinks shimmered over the lifeboats. My phone began to vibrate. A message. I shouldn't have received any signals. I felt cold as it said, "We saved a spot for you." I understood that the crew member wasn't the only one. It was the actual ship. Now, every cabin, every deck, and every hallway plotted. Escape was an illusion, not a decision. Behind me, the lifeboat bay door banged with such power that the metal walls shook. I believed that I was alone. The drinks, amber glow changed, spreading out like liquid fire across the floor. My palms scraped the damp metal as I slid toward the far end. I froze as I heard a single, gentle tap, like a glass on a table. Behind me there was another tap, closer and faster this time. My flashlight wavered. Regardless of anything physical, shadows moved. At that moment, I understood that the spacecraft was observing and learning about me. I discovered a ladder that led to a hatch. I ascended and came out into a small hallway. This corridor wasn't there normally. Mirrors were set into each panel of the smooth walls, and the crewman smiled while holding his tray in each reflection. In every one of them, his gaze followed me. I ignored the reverberating footsteps and bolted. Before opening onto a ballroom I had never seen before, the passageway twisted and turned. The amber light was refracted by chandelier crystals, creating dancing ghosts around the space. But it was only the music, and no guests. The sound of glasses clinking. The laughing, uncomfortably empty. "Sit, it's your turn." A whisper glided by my ear, and I staggered back, colliding with a table. Water splashed over the floor when a glass broke. Then, I caught sight of the passengers who had gone missing, standing at the room's boundaries, wet and unkempt, with broad smiles and hollow eyes. They silently raised their glasses in my direction. When I turned to run, I saw that the doors were actually waves rather than doors. Like the tide of a deep ocean, each one lapped at the floor before vanishing. The music grew louder. And there, in the middle, the taller-than-before crew member looks at dark voids as the tray shines with amber liquid. "Just one sip," he said in a voice that reverberated throughout the large room. "Then you will comprehend." I shook my head and ran to the closest exit. As I raced, the room grew longer and longer. The drowning passengers' reflections became more numerous. The walls curved around the doorways. With no breeze, the chandeliers swayed, creating warped shadows that were aimed at me. I recalled the voice memo I had previously recorded. I pushed play desperately, and my voice pierced the haze as I said, "If you're listening, take a second to subscribe to Midnight Outcry. It helps keep stories like this alive." The room stopped a heartbeat. The reflections stopped moving. A slow, intentional stretch that is impossible for human skin caused the crew member's smile to widen. The floor moved under me. Water gathered around my feet. Whispers turned into shouts, "Drink, stay, forever," as the walls started to close in. I jumped toward a doorway that had not existed just a moment before, a beam of light. Every breath was difficult. The air thickened like molasses, and pain shot through my chest. I didn't turn around. It wasn't the top deck when I staggered through the entrance. My cabin was there. Secure? Perhaps. However, The amber light persisted, leaking from the crevices beneath the door. I glanced at the message on my bed with trembling palms as it read, "We'll be waiting." All of my instincts told me to burn it, toss it away, or shred it, but fear and curiosity held me in place. The amber light beneath the cabin door pulsed slowly and purposefully, like a heartbeat. The door then opened with a squeak. It was a shift, not a push or nudge, like though the ship itself was testing me by breathing. I went cold. The slightest sound, clinking glasses, came from the hallway. A distorted, low laugh. I was afraid I may shatter my ribs from the intense pounding of my heart. One of the shadows crept through the door. The crewman. He was no longer human, though. Untouchable, the tray hung in midair, the drinks gleaming. It was impossible to look into his black wells of eyes. And behind him, the others who were traveling with me came out of the floor, the walls, and even the roof. Glassy-eyed, smiling, pallid, and drenched. The crew member's voice crept into my head and said, "Join us. Just drinking will make it easier." I staggered back and almost fell. The barriers melted into the ballroom as the space grew longer. Amber liquid dripped from chandeliers that twisted into hideous shapes and sizzled on the carpet. In unison, the passengers lifted their glasses, their empty, limitless mouths parted in quiet welcome. I took off running. Corridors folded like origami, and hallways twisted around me. I kept returning to the same ballroom no matter where I went. A chaotic, impossible symphony of music crescendoed. Shadows pulsed around the walls. With unfathomable speed, the crew members showed up at every nook and entryway. I snatched up the closest door and shut it. It gave way to a deck that I didn't recognize, with waves breaking over the rails but no view of the ocean. Wet and cold, fog clung to me. Passengers were dispersed and waiting, and I could see the glow of the amber drinks drifting in the fog. I sprinted for the lifeboats after hearing a whisper that said, "One sip, and it's over." With arms extended, the tall, incredibly slender crew member stepped into the road. His tray's golden liquid rushed toward me like a river. I launched myself sideways, causing a lifeboat to come loose. It rocked dangerously as it floated near the deck's edge. The passengers rushed forward from the fog, laughing, reaching, and remaining silent. Sliding the lifeboat over the railing, I dove into it and plummeted into the dark ocean below. I was pushed into the ship's side by waves. Underwater, I could hear the music, the laughter, and the clinking glasses echoing inside my skull. I came up. Overhead, the ship loomed, gleaming dimly, appearing impossible to scale, as if it had expanded during my sleep. The fog never stopped, and the water never stopped. It dawned on me then that I wasn't the only person in the lifeboat. I noticed a slight gleam. A shadow at the edge, a smiling crew member holding out the tray, and the amber liquid pooling at the bottom, shining softly. I went paddling. I let out a yell. I was completely engulfed by the fog. The ship waited somewhere, never stops waiting, and I had a gut feeling that this was not the end. That invitation, that drink, that sip, it beckoned. The ship was everlasting, but the ocean was boundless. Story 4. I used to view cruise ships as floating hotels, secure, routine, and somewhat dull, if I'm honest. It was not something I had ever believed in. Curses or places that were haunted. Before that, last year, I got on a ship out of Miami with some colleagues, anticipating nothing beyond inexpensive drinks and excessive buffet food. I go by Marcus, I'm 31 years old, and I work in the field of commercial printing in Orlando. I'm not easily scared. I've toiled during the night around massive printing machines in deserted warehouses, strolled home at 3 a.m. through the city center, and ignored numerous odd sounds. However, my experiences on that cruise transformed me. I first heard the music on the second night at sea. It's that detail I can't shake off. The sound, which was initially subdued but grew louder as it traveled through the ship's metal structure, as though the walls were imbued with a memory. It was the sound of violins, a complete string section, and soft horns as well, performing something ancient. Not pop songs or party tracks, but rather ballroom music, reminiscent of a 1930s black and white film. I recall stopping in the hallway, putting my hand on the chilly metal wall, and sensing the vibration. I wondered if there was a live band playing somewhere on the ship. When I reviewed the daily itinerary, however, I found that no activities were scheduled for that hour. But here's the thing, the music wasn't coming from the open decks or the show lounge. It originated from beneath, from a level that was meant to be locked down. That minor detail should have sufficed for me to leave. However, I did not. I pursued the source of the sound. The further I ventured in, the more I felt the ship was alive. I could feel the engines, constant drone reverberating through my shoes. Every breath carried the scent of salt water, and the corridor lights blinked in odd sequences, reminiscent of a heartbeat. As I arrived at a corroded stairwell located at the extreme end of the passenger decks, it dawned on me precisely where the music was guiding me, to the Grand Ballroom. However, that was illogical. For many years, the Grand Ballroom had been shut. It came back to me that I had read it in the welcome brochure. Historic ballroom, secured and kept intact for safety, no access allowed. Still, from behind the securely fastened double door, I could hear a complete orchestra rising in flawless accord. I lingered there longer than was wise, my ear nearly glued to the wooden surface of those ballroom doors. The sound was not muted, it thrived with clarity, each note resonating as if countless individuals were dancing on gleaming marble floors. I swear I even heard laughter, the sound of clinking champagne glasses, and the shuffle of shoes. However, the doors were secured with chains. They were sealed with a heavy brass lock, as if untouched for decades. I pulled once, twice, no movement. Still, the music streamed in, rising with a tune I partially recalled, reminiscent of something my grandmother would play on her vintage record player. I shared the story with my coworker Tyler over drinks that night. He dismissed it with laughter. Schiffe Gibbon Seltsam Gerausche von Sichmann. You have the engines, the water pressure, and all that metal creaking. You only hear what you want to hear. Perhaps he was correct. Perhaps I was looking for something unusual to disrupt the sameness of cruise games and diluted drinks. However, I was aware at the core of my being what I had heard. And it wasn't any pipes or machinery. It was a bloody orchestra. Es geschah wieder in der folgenden Nacht. This time, however, I was not by myself. After midnight, I had been wandering around restlessly, not prepared to return to my cabin. Again, that humming melody floated up the stairwell, and I froze. A woman emerged from the shadows at the end of the hall. She was in her late 50s, perhaps, with her hair neatly tied back and dressed in a plain navy dress. She bore the same look of wide-eyed astonishment that I must have had. Du Horst es auch, flüsterte sie. Not a question, an assertion. I gave a nod. Together we walked in silence until we arrived at the locked ballroom. As expected, the music swelled once more, horns blaring, as though the conductor had signaled for a crescendo. She made the sign of the cross while whispering, "God help us." I found that disturbing. "Is this your first time here?" I made an inquiry. She moved her head from side to side. "Aber meinem Mann hat es gestern gehört." He assumed it was merely the crew goofing off. However, when I came to look earlier, I found him here, gazing at the doors. Stated that he witnessed someone enter, as she added, no one else saw it. Her voice cracked. And he never returned to the cabin. It sent a chill down my spine. Before I had the chance to reply, a soft clack reverberated from the ballroom. The door's chain had moved. Then, as though invisible hands were playing with it, the padlock opened with a snap. The music came to a complete halt. What followed was a silence that felt worse than the sound. The woman inhaled sharply, her hand clenching my arm with such force that I could feel her nails digging into my skin. In a whisper, she said, "It wants us to go inside." I believed her for the first time ever in my life. I ought to have turned and walked away. My every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to race down the hallway and act as if none of this had happened. However, the woman's grip held me in place. Her gaze was locked onto the brass lock, now hanging loosely in the chain as if it had been opened just for us. The doors opened inward with a creak, revealing a narrow glimpse of darkness. Neither light nor dust, only emptiness. However, it was accompanied by a subtle odor that was sharp and metallic, combined with a sweet yet decayed scent reminiscent of flowers in stagnant water for too long. I murmured, "What's your name?" "Carol", sagte sie, ihre Stimme zitternd. "Und wenn wir da reingehen, Marcus, kommen wir nicht zurück." When she said my name, I flinched. Ich hatte nicht gesagt, wer ich war. I was about to ask a question, but she put a finger to her lips and gestured. Within that gap, something glimmered. In the darkness, a tall and deliberate shadow moved, accompanied by the faint sound of a bow on strings. Then, the music came back. This time, however, it was not muffled. It shot through the opening with such intensity that I staggered back and covered my ears. Violins screeched, horns trumpeted, drums thumped. It had ceased to be a waltz. It had become chaos, a cacophony of noise that was too jarring, too rapid, and too incorrect to be considered human. Carol collapsed onto her knees, grasping her head. I crouched down to assist her, but when I glanced through the gap once more, I became motionless. Inside, there were people. They lined up, their outlines moving in flawless time, like dancers frozen in a moment of movement. The outlines of their forms shimmered with a faint glow, akin to candlelight dancing on the surface of water. None possessed faces, only vacant space where mouths and eyes ought to have been. Individually, they rotated their heads in our direction. The doors flew wide open. Carol let out a scream. I seized her hand, yanking her backward as the figures advanced, not by walking, but by gliding, their shapes wavering in and out with every jarring sound. The corridor was filled with faceless dancers who brushed past us without making contact. Yet, whenever one came close, a chill shot down my spine and froze me to the bone. The orchestra grew louder, to the point that it shook the walls. I lost focus of my sight. Under my shoes, the carpet moved, blue and gold giving way to marbled checkered tiles glistening with moisture. Above us, a chandelier swung, despite there being no reason for one to be there. It dripped candle wax that sizzled upon contact with the ground. Ich blinzelte. Und plötzlich waren wir nicht mehr am Flur. We found ourselves in the ballroom. Hundreds of dancers occupied the floor, their pale forms adorned in exquisite garments from a bygone century. The orchestra was positioned at the far end, all skeletal, with their fingers stretching impossibly long over their instruments. The conductor, who was tall and dressed in a black cloak, faced us. His face appeared hollow. Nur Dunkelheit, wo ein Gesicht sein sollte. He raised his conductor's stick, and every dancer halted in their tracks. Carol murmured, "This isn't a good place for us to have come to." The conductor brought the baton down directly toward us. The air became denser, weighing down my chest as if I were suffocating in water. I found myself ensnared by the conductor's empty stare, the emptiness where his face ought to be felt more suffocating than if he had eyes. I tightened my grip on Carol's hand. She shook, her knuckles as cold as a corpse's. The baton went up again. The dancers moved. They gradually rotated their featureless heads in our direction, their bodies moving in a disturbing synchrony. Then they started to move, with a noise like the wind hurrying through a cave, not toward one another, but toward us. I whispered, "Run," even though the word was stuck in my throat. We made an attempt. However, the room had ceased to be a room. The door we had come through was no longer there. Instead, mirrored walls extended infinitely in all directions. Chandeliers multiplied above, dripping wax that hissed like snakes. The air was thick and moist with the pungent odor of salt water, as if the whole ballroom lay submerged beneath the depths. The music transitioned back into a waltz, but this time the rhythm aligned flawlessly with my heartbeat. I sensed it in my teeth and ribs. With their graceful movements and lack of sound, the dancers encircled us until we found ourselves in the middle of the ballroom. As the first one made contact with her, Carol let out a scream. Though its hand was not solid, but resembled chilled vapor, It sank into her shoulder as if her body were made of clay. As the faceless figure leaned in closer and pressed its forehead against hers, she convulsed, her mouth open in a silent scream. I pulled her back, but something kept me anchored. My shoes adhered to the floor like tar. When I glanced down, I noticed that the marble tiles had transformed into something darker, damp boards of decaying wood. Under my weight, they creaked and groaned like the hull of a ship going down. Marcus, flüsterte Carol mit kraxender Stimme. Lass sie nicht dazu bringen, dass du tanzt. Initially, I didn't get it, but then I experienced it. My body sways, my arms lift themselves, and my feet move to the beat of the music. It wasn't my choice, it was the orchestra's. My arms and legs were now the conductor's to control, like a puppet's strings. The cold touch of the faceless dancers drew closer, brushing against my arms and chest. One of them took my hand and positioned it softly against the concave curve of its waist. Another one seized my shoulder, propelling me into a turn. The conductor's baton cut down, and every figure surged in flawless unison, the room becoming a whirlwind of movement. Carol was next to me, ensnared as well. Her body twitched as she struggled against the invisible force drawing her into the dance. Our eyes met, hers round with fright. Marcus, wenn wir nicht anhalten, bleiben wir hier. For eternity. I was struck by the thought, as if it were ice water. Perhaps all these dancers were the lost and missing, those who had boarded this ship decades earlier and never came back. Trapped in an eternal waltz, without identity or name, tied to music that never ceased. I battled with all my strength, compelling my body to stagger rather than glide, yet the music punished me. The violin screeched so violently that my ears rang. The chandeliers swung back and forth like crazy, scattering hot wax onto my skin. The floor below me surged up and down like a vessel in a tempest. And then I noticed it. There was a door behind the conductor, only just discernible through the fog, made of wood, cracked, and featuring a brass porthole in the middle. It appeared genuine, in contrast to everything else around here. Solid. It was also seen by Carol. She silently spoke one word, "Ge." However, the conductor noticed. With a sharp motion, he raised his baton, and every dancer immediately came to a halt. At least, the music was something. The silence, by contrast, was far worse. For a brief instant, the whole ballroom was silent with anticipation. He then directed the baton at the door, and the orchestra burst forth once more, this time with greater volume, increased speed, and a wrathful intensity. The dancers screamed together despite lacking mouths. Their hands raked at me, attempting to draw me further into the spiral. Carol disappeared from my view, engulfed by the anonymous throng. I ripped myself away and dashed toward that door, with every step feeling as if I were trudging through wet concrete. The conductor elevated his baton further, and the music became intolerable, reverberating through my skull to the point that I believed it would crack open. The floor warped, fissures gaping open as black water oozed through. However, I made it to the door. I struck the cold brass handle with my palm. And then, the handle was slick and damp from condensation, feeling almost alive in my grasp. In my desperation, I pulled it hard, and the door opened with a screech. A wave of cold, salty air struck me, bringing with it the unmistakable aroma of the open sea. The music rose into a crescendo behind me. Violins screamed, horns sounded loudly, and the timpani roared like a heartbeat. I took the risk of looking back once and regretted it. The dancers had lost their human shape. They had transformed into streaks of shadow, with arms unnaturally elongated and their hollow faces caving in as if gravity were consuming them. At the heart of everything, the conductor's head, which had no face, leaned back. From the emptiness where his mouth ought to be came a sound that was not music but rather the thunderous noise of the ocean. Carol had left. Engulfed in that tempest of indistinct shapes, I lurched through the door and banged it shut behind me. The sound was interrupted immediately. Quietness. the type that makes your ears ring due to its completeness. I stood in a narrow corridor that was rusted. Condensation trickled down the walls, and the steel emitted a gentle groan as if it were alive. Far above, the ship's engines throbbed softly and steadily like a heartbeat in the dark. For a brief time, I believed I was out of danger. I collapsed onto the floor, struggling for breath. My shirt was damp and clung to my skin while my hands shook uncontrollably. However, as my breathing became more regular, I noticed something. The distant sound of music. This time, not loud, not the entire orchestra. Only one violin, leisurely and sorrowful, wafting down the hallway like vapor. I pushed myself to my feet and staggered toward the noise, ending up in front of a different door. It was a simple steel hatch with peeling paint, not grand or gilded. My instincts screamed at me not to open it, but I had no other option. I shoved it to the side and stumbled out into my own cabin. Identical inexpensive carpet. Same subtle hum of the air conditioning. I placed my suitcase against the wall and tossed my jacket across the chair. For a moment, I nearly thought it had all been a dream. With the exception of that, I was not by myself. The picture was on my bed, the one I never recalled taking. A ballroom suspended in time, the musicians in the midst of a performance, the dancers caught in their twirl. And I saw Carol in the corner, almost obscured by darkness. Her face was half erased, already disappearing into blankness. I retreated, my throat parched, when something icy grazed my pocket. I reached in and retrieved the keycard for my cabin, only it was not the one provided by the cruise line. This one had more age to it, was heavier, and had corroded edges. 2 words were engraved deeply across the surface. Zutrit zur Balsa location. I let it go, but it adhered to my palm as if it were part of my skin. Before I lost consciousness, that was the last distinct memory I recalled. The following morning, I found myself awake in my home bed. Without explanation. Kind Schiff. 9. Carol. Only quietness and the noise of my own labored breathing. I wondered if I had lost my mind and whether it was all just a fever dream. Until I got up and felt the weight in my pocket once more. The key card remained in place. The following morning, I found myself awake in my home bed. Without explanation. Kind Schiff. 9. Carol. Only quietness and the noise of my own labored breathing. For a long while, I waited there for the subtle tremor of engines, the steel creak of the hull, and the muted rise of an unseen ocean. However, there was nothing. My house felt hollow, as if the air had lost all warmth. When I finally compelled myself to go to the bathroom, I saw my reflection in the mirror and froze. For a split second, I thought I glimpsed silent, faceless dancers swaying in rows behind me. Before disappearing into the glass-like mist, their heads turned toward me. I wondered if I had lost my mind and whether it was all just a fever dream, until I got up and felt the weight in my pocket once more. The keycard remained in place, and very softly, so softly that I wished to convince myself it was merely my nerves, I heard the sound of a violin playing somewhere within the walls of my house. Story 5. They said that the ballroom was locked, but I could actually hear the laughter, like muffled echoes from a party I wasn't invited to. It reverberated through the steel hallway walls. Voices that didn't belong to anybody still alive. Music and clinking glasses. Before this vacation, I had never been on a cruise. My name is Evan Miller, and I am 34 years old. I work as a paramedic in Denver, Colorado, and while I'm accustomed to trauma calls and restless nights, this tranquility is different. After I went through a difficult breakup, my younger sister got me this ticket. She advised me to recharge before exhausting myself. Even though I didn't want to spend a week with strangers, I reasoned that perhaps the ocean would be beneficial. Although I'm not the kind to seek out crowds, I reasoned that I could hide in the sun, read books, and possibly eat at the buffet when no one else was around. I noticed something strange as soon as I got on board. The main ballroom, one section of the ship, was closed off. Every door going there had been padlocked, despite the brochures, gorgeous pictures of it with enormous chandeliers hanging above polished marble floors. Restricted area was written on a polished brass sign outside. No admission. During supper, passengers discussed it in whispers, half in jest, half out of curiosity. Every question was sidestepped by the personnel. There were rumors that it was being renovated. Others asserted that it had not been utilized for many years. I strolled along a more sedate hallway close to the ballroom that first evening, when the majority of people were enjoying the theater performance. I halted when I thought I heard a faint sound in the empty hall. The way ship engines can occasionally hum and fool your hearing made me initially believe it was all in my head. Then the sound grew sharper. Strings. Sweet vintage violin music, the type you could hear at a formal ball. Then there was laughter, high and airy and overlapping, like dozens of people having a good time. At the locked doors, I stood. Here, the music was clearer and louder, giving the impression that the ballroom was packed and lively. I tried to grab the handle, but the chain stopped me. Then there was a sudden rattle, as if a hand from the opposite side had touched the handle. I quickly took a step back as my skin pricked. Later, I told a crew member, a server carrying drink trays, and he gave me a strange stare before whispering, "Don't linger there after dark." He left before I could ask him what he meant. I attempted to dismiss it. Perhaps the sound carried strangely through the ship's hull, or perhaps they kept recordings playing for maintenance checks. However, as I lay awake in my cabin that night, I vowed to myself that I could still hear the faint sound of glasses clinking as they drifted through the ventilation shaft above my bed. It should have been better on the second night. Cruises were, after all, meant to be about finding your rhythm, live music, movies beneath the stars, and poolside beverages. However, the sound I had heard outside the ballroom persisted in my mind. I could still hear the laughter in my thoughts as if it had been at my shoulder. I attempted to persuade myself that it was a late-night crew gathering. However, a bartender's smile momentarily faltered when I asked him about it in passing. Then he shook his head and pushed his smile back like a switch. "This voyage has been closed by ballroom," he stated bluntly. "Renovations. So why is there so much noise at night?" I pushed. I could tell more by the way his eyes slid past me than from what he said. "Perhaps last night was a bit too much for you, sir. It occurs on cruises." He laughed, but it was a phony laugh. My first serious red flag was that. By 2 in the morning, I lay in my cabin and gazed up at the ceiling. Through the walls came a low, muted, yet repetitive thrum. Before I realized the pattern, I assumed it was the engine, a waltz, a total of 3 beats, again and again. And behind that, there was a swell of clinking glass, applause, and then an unwelcome sound, chairs scratching against wood. With my heart pounding, I sat up. I wasn't dreaming. The lights were turned down to night mode in the hallway, casting a faint orange tint over everything. Another traveler stood, listening in her robe, barefoot, a few doors down. "You hear it too?" she said, as she glanced at me. I was about to respond when the sound abruptly stopped, as if someone had pulled the record player's plug. The noise was worse than the silence that followed. Both of us held our breath as we stood there. Then the scrape came again, faintly, from behind the ballroom doors 2 decks below us. Only one slow, lengthy drag. For me, that was the final typical moment of the cruise. I descended to deck 5 the following morning. Brass fittings were polished. Glass doors were secured with a heavy chain, and the ballroom entry shone. I leaned down to see a printed notice that read, "Closed for maintenance, no entry." I thought I saw something when I cupped my hands about my eyes, but the glass was immaculate, almost too immaculate. Finger smears, smudges from the inside. I felt sick to my stomach. I placed my ear on the glass, but I'm not sure why. Nothing. Nothing but quiet. The door wasn't as cool as the glass should have been in the ship's air-conditioned corridor, which is when I noticed something odd. The temperature was warm. It was almost too warm. A man wearing a cream-colored server's jacket was observing me from a few feet distant when I took a step back. In contrast to the crew uniforms I had seen at dinner, his attire was clean and well-preserved. This appeared older, as if it were from an other decade. He merely grinned slightly, as if I were interrupting him, without saying anything. Then he turned and strode down the hallway. I did the same. However, the corridor was deserted when I rounded the bend. Later that day at the buffet, passengers poured past me, laughing and conversing. Perhaps they didn't want to, but none of them appeared to notice the man I had seen. I was beginning to see that not everyone wanted to accept this. I made the decision to put myself to the test that evening. At 1:55 a.m., I set an alarm and waited. The music started up again at precisely 2, glass cracking, muffled talking, and rising violins. I got out of bed this time. I quickly headed for the ballroom doors after grabbing my phone and shoving it into my pocket. I think I noticed the tiniest glow oozing out from under the frame as I got closer. Like chandeliers swinging over dancers' golden light pulses, I grabbed the handle. The chain clattered against the glass as though it had been pulled simultaneously by something on the other side. My breath caught. Then a low, derisive voice pressed itself into the back of my neck and said, "Are you late for the party?" I turned around. The hallway was deserted. I ought to have ran. I chose to record the door by raising my phone instead. Furthermore, my reflection was not what shone on the screen. Dozens of hazy people with faces turned toward me swirled in slow motion, and all of them were grinning. I didn't get any more sleep that night. The recording stopped at the precise moment that the glass door displayed individuals who weren't there, and I simply laid in bed with the phone on my chest. The figures moved in a different way each time I pressed play. Instead of looping like a glitch, they were moving and responding, and observing me constantly. I looked completely messed up by breakfast. A worried-looking woman leaned over at my table. "Hard night?" she politely inquired. I nearly told her. However, the words froze as soon as I opened my mouth. I had a gut feeling that expressing it aloud would make it worse. Rather, I simply excused myself with a faint smile. I wasn't the only one who concealed fatigue. 3 cabins with "Do Not Disturb" signs that hadn't been moved in days caught my attention in the hallway. Additionally, the family I had seen on the first night, the 2 children and the father in the Hawaiian shirt, suddenly stopped attending meals. They were missing, but no one appeared to notice. I recognized then that this was more than just nighttime sounds. People were being taken. Like a magnet, the ballroom doors drew me in. I crept back down to deck 5 that afternoon while the majority of the people were out on the pool deck. The sign was still hanging, and the chain was still tight, but there was something new. A woman's sandal was lying on the carpet directly in front of the doors. One of those inexpensive gift shops seen on cruise ships. It was wet. I knelt, touched it, and almost flinched away. It was something darker than water that made the sole sticky. After that, my hand had a slight iron odor. I felt like puking. There was the sound of footsteps. With my heart racing, I turned to see that it was just a crewman carrying a mop bucket. He looked first at me, and then at the sandal I was holding. As if he had just given me the most casual death warning in the world, he whispered, "You shouldn't linger here." And then he disappeared around the corner. The music arrived earlier that evening. Sharply at midnight, it began, louder than ever. Beneath the door, the illumination from the chandelier poured forth once again like golden fog. Before my brain could react, my body moved. With one hand on the chain and my phone in my hand, I stood there shaking. I considered walking away and acting as though I hadn't witnessed any of it. I considered calling security, but I was prepared for the nice smiles and dismissed reasons that would follow. They would not assist me. "Just one peek," I said to myself, and when I pulled, the chain shook. To my shock, it fell loose. On the carpet, the lock clattered. My blood became icy. The door gave an inward creak. I felt a rush of warmth, like if I had entered a packed room where people had been huddled for hours. There was no mistaking the scent. Cigar smoke, perfume, and bubbly champagne. Then the noise. No longer muffled, the sound of a full band. Violins, trumpets, and laughter rising above it was deafening. My eyes adjusted, and I comprehended what I was seeing. There was life in the ballroom. Under sparkling chandeliers, hundreds of people danced. Men in sharp tuxedos, hair slicked and gleaming. Women in gowns adorned with sequins. Waiters skillfully navigated through the crowd while carrying drink trays. Additionally, a grand piano with hands-free keys played in the center. My mouth was dry as I stood motionless at the doorway. All of the guests moved elegantly, yet their expressions were incorrect. Every laugh reverberated for too long. Every smile stretched too widely. They had unblinking, glass-like eyes. Then, slowly, dozens of heads turned toward me in perfect harmony. The music continued. However, the dancing did. Every hair on my arm stood on end. A tall, white waiter emerged from the throng and approached me. He held a silver tray with 2 glasses of champagne. My throat tightened as he halted a few inches away, bowed slightly, and said, in a velvety voice, "Your invitation, sir." My legs begged to sprint. Before I could stop it, though, my hand twitched toward the glass. I pulled it back. "No," I croaked. The waiter's eyes flashed something sharp, yet his grin remained constant. "No one says no," he muttered. The crowd behind him started to wobble, moving jerkily and strangely, as though they were being pulled by strings. They whispered something I couldn't understand as their tongues moved in perfect unison. The door behind me slammed at that moment. The sound of the door slamming sounded like a shot. My heart lurched into my throat. I whirled and scratched at the handle, but it remained in place. The chain that had just fallen was now back in its original position, winding around the lock like a snake. The crowd had moved closer as I turned around again. They had stopped dancing. They were circling, grinning. The light from the chandelier struck their watery eyes, but none of them blinked. The waiter's hand remained perfectly still as he held out the champagne flute. "Drink," he whispered. I violently shook my head. The whispering started when someone said, "I don't belong here." Not just one voice, but all of them simultaneously. The chandeliers flickered as hundreds of mouths moved in unison, words gliding through the air like oil. "You're already here." The glitzy dresses and tuxedos vanished for a split second. I saw seawater bloated bodies with hair that seemed to be floating underwater and eyes that were sunken but mouths that were still smiling in an odd way. The lights then blinked back and their beauty returned. I staggered back and almost ran into a red-dressed woman. Her perfume was chokingly delicious as she moved close. Her voice cracked in 2 registers at once as she snarled, "Dance with me." Her icy, unforgiving hand closed tightly around my wrist. I wrenched free, heart jackhammering, and sprinted through the crowd. They spread out like a wave, observing me without obstructing me. A few people laughed. Others made a faux toast, clinking their glasses together. The sound surged louder, swelling till it rattled in my teeth. At the far end of the ballroom, I saw another set of doors. I might have a chance if I could get to them, if they opened. I pushed by 2 giggling males whose skin felt like rubber and ran away. The shiny brass handles of the doors shone as they loomed. I pulled them as hard as I could. They remained still, not a single inch. The music abruptly stopped behind me. I went cold. The quiet felt oppressive. Hundreds of feet shuffling in perfect harmony was the next sound to be heard. Slowly, I turned. Little by little, the whole audience was approaching me with frozen smiles. Like soldiers marching, their shoes clicked together on the hardwood floor. With my fists hurting, I screamed and banged on the doors. "Give me a break." Although no one was near enough to touch me, someone murmured against my ear, "No exit, only entry." Then, suddenly, the chandeliers above exploded, sending glass fragments flying. No one in the crowd flinched. All they did was halt and raise their heads, their faces lit by the flames now licking the ceiling. One low note was struck by the pianist, who was still invisible. The entire room burst out laughing. I sank to my knees, covering my ears. This was no longer laughter. My bones ached from the roar, the symphony of insanity. The server was standing just inches away when I ventured to look up. The audience halted, waiting as he stooped down, set the champagne glass on the floor in front of me, and muttered, "You drink, or you stay." They didn't breathe at all. As I reached for the drink, my hand shook. The stem pulsed softly like a heartbeat and felt warm against my fingers. The throng let out a collective sigh, reeking of decay and sea as I raised it. Before everything became hazy, I had one last thought. Nobody wins this choice. Something inside of me yelled, louder than the piano and louder than the crowd, just as the glass was about to reach my lips. "Don't. I threw it on the ground. Like acid, it fractured and fizzed on the wood. The laughter abruptly stopped. For the first time, their smiles wavered as each head snapped toward the shattered fragments. Then their smiles turned down, one by one. Jaws dropped wider than humanly conceivable, faces contorted, and faces stretched grotesquely. What came next was a guttural moan, hundreds of voices vibrating in unison, neither laughter nor whispering. The flames in the chandelier went out. Everything was engulfed in darkness. My eyes adjusted, and I saw that the ballroom was empty. Not a crowd, no music, just a cavernous space crammed with tables covered in dust. The smell of stagnant water and mildew filled the air. The waitress had left. I briefly believed that I had gotten away. I felt a wave of relief until I saw the mirror on the far wall. I wasn't alone in it. I was encircled by my reflection. The people were still there, dancing, laughing, and toasting with their glasses. However, the room was empty when I turned. They existed just in the glass, and I saw myself in the midst of them all, grinning, holding a flute of full champagne. Although I stumbled back, the reflection did not follow. It remained there, smiling, raising the glass. Around it, the others cheered and clapped inaudibly. The reflection's lips hardly moved as it spoke. I rushed because the words, "You already drank," were in my thoughts, not in my ears. I continued until I exploded onto the main deck, gasping for oxygen like a man drowning in salty night air. The ship was quiet and serene, as if nothing had occurred. But as I looked back at the glass door, I saw that the ballroom's mirror was still filled with chandeliers and laughter. And I swear I saw myself there, smiling endlessly, locked in mid-toast. I never returned. No, not to that ballroom. No, not to that cruise line. Since it's so difficult to describe, I don't even share this tale with individuals I know. However, occasionally I hear soft music while I'm sitting at home in the middle of the night. A piano playing, then the sound of glasses clinking and hushed laughing. Additionally, there is always a mirror close by, catching just enough light to make me hesitant to take a quick look at it. Please, do yourself a favor if you ever find yourself on a cruise and you pass a closed ballroom that nobody ever seems to access. Don't pay attention, avoid looking, and continue walking if you hear music coming from behind the doors, since some parties never end. All they do is wait for you. 2.